Welcome to this week's episode of the AIOps Evolution Podcast. I'm your host, Sean McDermott. Join Bill and I as we discuss how AIOps can help mitigate risk and help your enterprise during uncertain times. We also tackle the hot button topic, can IT be put on autopilot? And be sure to stay tuned at the end of the episode for a very exciting announcement. Enjoy the show. Welcome, everybody, to the AIOps Evolution Podcast. I'm your host, Sean McDermott, and Bill Driscoll is my co-host. Bill, how are you doing today?
Doing great. How are yourself, Sean?
Good. It's been an interesting week. So,
a lot going on in the world right now.
Yeah, that's an understatement. Well, we could go on all day about that, but we're going to talk about AIOps instead today. So, so we're going to jump right into it. We've got a couple articles to kind of jump off our conversations, and one I thought was somewhat timely, right? And it's how to use AI and data analytics to improve decision making in uncertain times. And we are certainly in uncertain times right now.
Yeah. Yep, we certainly are.
That was an enthusiastic response. Yeah. Anyways, okay. So we'll jump right into it. So this article, we'll run through this one really quick because it really, I think it's more the concept of, hey, knowledge changes over time. Technology, matures and refines over time. And now we're in a world where, they make references to life and death, and I kind of understand that. But there certainly is a lot of going on around the world as far as wars and climate change and all kinds of crazy things, that the more data we have, the more we can understand. We can start doing predictable analysis and trending, and that's really what AI is all about. And well, AIOps is really, one of the primary use cases is looking at that. So they spend a fair amount of time talking about, just the use of AI in decision making. So, what did you think about this article?
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of, I think is it Nassim Taleb wrote about the Black Swan and kind of the things that you don't, do I have that right, the term? But, things that the unexpected, and he really talked about the housing crash and the market crashes in the past as examples of just things that you don't really see in the data, but you sort of, the unexpected is going to happen. And I think right now, with COVID, nobody saw that coming, although you could say it was a possibility. And the same thing with the war in Ukraine right now and the aggression, it was always a possibility. But, do you plan for those circumstances or not? And I think the point of the article isn't directly about AIOps, although they tie in AIOps, but it's more about AI and taking into consideration external data and those, if you're in uncertain times, are you collecting data about that uncertain times? And so, in the case of, relating that to AIOps, you can look only at your data about how is my IT performing, but are you also pulling in how is the business performing? How are the business metrics performing? How are the things that impact your business performing? And it's important to have that context in how your IT is performing, or let that context start to inform. We need to start preparing to get capacity somewhere. I don't think there's any AIOps or monitoring system that was going to tell business leaders like you should, redirect where you're putting your network, or where you're, building more resiliency, or getting things, resources out of the Ukraine, or whatever it might be. You just need to know that. You need to be able to pull that kind of information in. But how that ties to AI, is AI going to be the one doing that? It kind of gets back to, the humans need to be part of this as well, and to read the climate.
Yeah, I think that the interesting thing, right, is when you look at, let's just look at the most recent things like the war in Ukraine, right? Look at climate change, look at COVID. You look back in time, you look backwards from it, and it actually was fairly predictable, right? Yeah. We just didn't see it at the time. So part of this is understanding this mindset that a lot of things actually are predictable, and there are signs out there that something's going to happen, right? And I mean, you look at Russia, and they're basically saying he's been planning for years for this, and planning stockpiles, reserves based on sanctions and things like that. And these are a lot of signs that individual people saw, but there was really no global consensus, or actually, quite honestly, I think a lot of naivete, right? Where and you look at COVID, there was a team that was set up for pandemics, and a whole process by which we would respond to a global pandemic that essentially was dismantled under the last administration. It was put in place by the Obama administration, and so there were a lot of people out there thinking about these big problems, but they're just generally not heard. And I think if we apply that to the IT world, you can start thinking about and say, okay, it was a lack of supply chain predictable, right? If when the pandemic hit, right, and the lack of semiconductors and things like that, and you look back on it and say, oh, okay, well that seemed like a natural consequence. So I think IT leaders need to start understanding how to look a little bit in the future and start thinking about scenarios that aren't obvious today. And one way to do that actually is to start looking at your data. And this article talks about kind of small set data, large set data. I think that there's actually a lot of things to find in large set data, and that's part of the problem today, is that you don't have the ability to process the vast amounts of data that's coming in. And using machine learning and AI, we now have the ability to start processing through all that data and starting to look for the little signs here and there, and how to train your algorithms to start, really bubbling up smaller things that, when pieced together, can be a big thing, right?
Yeah.
And so nothing really super. They did make one point that I thought they made 2 points in this article that I thought were worth just kind of highlighting. One was, in times of uncertainty, the biggest challenge is to resist giving into hype. Decluttering entails understanding the business priorities and plugging the gaps. And I thought that's a good statement. And then the other part is the other thing they said is, the final part is to course correct, validate, and course correct as much as needed. The bottom line is to be equipped with accurate information to make decisions in real time by striking a balance of technology. So in order to make decisions in real time, you're going to have better data, better process data, better pattern identification in order to make decisions real time. So I thought those were 2 good points.
Yeah, and I just say, I mean, AIOps in and of itself is one of those things we're sort of saying we can see coming, but it's hard for today's operations, or if you're kind of stuck in kind of how you do things today, it's hard to see how things could be different. It's a sunny day out now. Can I envision it being rainy and a hurricane coming through? It's hard to imagine that when you look now. But I think the reality is those companies that don't embrace AIOps and AI and machine learning in their operations are going to be surprised someday. And, it's been coming for a while. So.
Yeah, that's what we've been talking about, right? I mean, it's coming no matter you want it or not, right? Because a lot of the tools that you're using are going to be embedding it. So you're getting AI, you're getting machine learning, whether you like it or not. And I think in general, it's a good thing. So, All right, moving on. So the second article came up, and we can kind of go through this pretty quickly, because I think that this is, again, a reinforcement of what we've been talking about for the last year on AIOps. So 7 solid reasons to consider AIOps. And this came out of ZDNet article by John McKendrick. And so this one is really just identifying, 7 use cases, right? 7 solid reasons and use cases. And, he makes a point up front that we've talked about before, and I continue to talk about. And I mean, kind of the theme of today's episode, I think, is looking back over the last 30 years of my career in IT ops, right? And I started working in IT ops probably in 1990, 89, and gosh, that's 33 years, right? Yeah. We've seen everything, right? We've seen, from the beginning of distributed computing. I mean, one of my first jobs, I had an internet connection, the only internet connection, and first internet connection in the Department of Justice, maybe the first internet connection in the civilian government, and it was running on a 386 under my desk, right, with a dial-up connection modem with SCO Unix, and now here we are today. So I've kind of got this perspective that I'm old and I've seen all this stuff, and what I've seen over the years is just cyclical problems, right? That almost to the point where you can make the case like, boy, we haven't really solved anything in 30 years because we're still dealing with X, Y, and Z. But the reality is that the goal line keeps shifting, right? So we're still having a problem managing alerts, but not the problem we had 20 years ago, because the problem we had 20 years ago is that we were getting, 1,000 alerts a day or 1,000 alerts an hour. Now we're getting, gigabytes of alerts an hour, right? Or a minute, right? So the goal line keeps moving, but we still keep talking about the same problem. So we'll get into that in our last article. But in this, he basically says, one of the first points he makes is IT leaders face massive challenges to be efficient because they have added too many tools and have become siloed, and they have a lot of and in addition to fragmented data. And we've been talking about this for years, right? I mean, we literally started a company to help IT leaders understand how to do tools rationalization, and I've been doing tools rationalization since I started Windward in 1997. It was one of my first engagements back in 1997 was a tools rationalization. So we've had this tools rationalization forever. We've had this siloed organization problem forever. And because of silos, you have fragmented data, right? A lot of people are collecting their own data and it's not being shared and not being really brought together in a collaborative way. So that's kind of my first point. So do you have any points to make before we get into the 7 areas?
Yeah, I think that you mentioned, what's really changed, and the more they change, the more they stay the same. But what's changed is the pace of change. When I was at Windward 15 years ago, and one of our big customers was Nextel, which became Sprint, and everything was managed like a project. So anytime they were upgrading some switch, base station, cell site, whatever the technology was in the network, there would be a project about it. And then it was, what do we need to update in all of the different systems and make sure we test and validate the releases? And there was like a quarterly release basis. Now those changes in the cloud, and I mean, it's many changes per night, per day. And I think that's what's really changed. And then the ability to just generate so much data, the amount of observability and the amount of tools and amount of logs and events being generated for really everything that happens inside the system is generating, a tremendous amount of noise. And so that change, the volume of change, the speed of change, and, and the fact that instances are going up and down, and then the data being generated. I mean, that's what solving all of these problems that are the 7 problems was still hard, but it was so much at a scale, so much easier in the 2000s because you could kind of get your arms around things. And now it requires a lot more automation and a lot more kind of intelligence and higher level kind of rules and models that kind of handle these processes.
Yeah. I agree. Yeah. The pace of change is really, really just staggering how things change so fast. And it leads us to the same problems, right? That we've always had.
Problems.
So
the same.
So when we look at the 7 reasons to consider, again, 7 use cases, I always say, we've got, I'm just going to kind of read them out because we don't need to go into too much detail. Reduce IT noise and alert fatigue, speedier root cause analysis, ability to correlate events, contextual alert event, incident enrichment, anomaly detection. And I think of those as really kind of the core use cases that we see going on in our clientele right now. It's really all about event handling, right? And how do you do that? And again, you kind of brought up an excellent point. It's the pace of change and the scale of change, because I could go back and literally find emails from 15 years ago talking about these exact same things. How do I reduce the alarms coming into my NOC? How do we do root cause analysis? We used to work with a company called Micromuse back in the day that was all about single pane of glass. There's a reference here to single pane of glass. We worked with a company called Riversoft that was all about topology and root cause analysis. And this was 15 years ago. I mean, we're talking like 2005, right? And so the use cases are still the same, but where AI and ML comes into play in this is just that we're talking about NOCs that were handling 1 million alerts a day to, IT organizations that are handling alerts of, 10 billion a day, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the ability
Right.
to do it. And then there were two other use cases. One was enhanced capacity planning, resource utilization. I think this is probably more of a DevOps type role use
Mm-hmm.
case, which is perfectly makes sense from an AIOps perspective. And the last is self-healing and automation capabilities. And I think this is where we're going in the future, right? We've really got to there's a lot of work to be doing in automation. And when I think about automation, I'm not talking about just opening up a ticket, right? Because that can be done today. I'm talking about true self-healing across an end-to-end process that requires interaction of multiple capabilities and technologies in order to execute that self-healing, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
a problem may not necessarily be solved by just clicking a box in one software application. You may have to go into multiple software applications to then ultimately make the change that you need to make. So,
Yep. One of the things we
so
talk about automation just being in the remediation, which takes it to the point of it's being fixed. But I think I think when you orchestrate the remediation and look at all the if thens and decision points and look at this, if this is the case, then go here. There's a lot of troubleshooting that may take the process up to the point of remediation, but not actually remediating. But you can still automate a lot of that troubleshooting and pretty much display to the human, like, here's the investigation that we've done and all the steps that we're taking, and we believe this is the problem is either here or here, and you take it from there. So self-healing and automation around towards remediation, there's still even if you don't get to the full self-healing and actually fixing issues, there's still a lot of orchestration and automation that can happen in just the troubleshooting process.
I agree. All right. So that brings us to our last article. And, I found this article interesting because, again, I think the theme of this is, we've been around for a long time. Have we seen things before? And so this is basically an article coming out of MIT Technology Review called "The AI Promise Put IT on Autopilot." And my first reaction to this was, if I hear the term, autopilot and IT one more time, because I've heard it so many times over 30 years, and it's never materialized, I think it's a promise, or it's a conversation people are having and setting expectations that aren't going to be met. And I don't think it's going to be met with AIOps either. I think the reality is that you're not putting an IT organization on autopilot. You're giving them the tools to do more with less, right? And that's the one thing I've heard for 30 years too. Is like, we've got to do more with less. And now we've got to do way more with less, right?
Yeah.
Or we got to do more with the same, or way more with the same. So I'll let you kind of take the lead on this article, because I got some biases to this that I'll jump in on. So.
Yeah, and it was MIT Technology Review, but it was in partnership with HP Enterprises. So it sort of talks about the whole overview, sort of how AIOps works and why, the challenge, of just dealing with capacity, dealing with all the root cause and fixing things like we all saw in the last article, and just the complexity. And so once they sort of establish that, they talk about, how AIOps works, which really takes you through the normal steps we pretty much just talked about, which is, monitor a bunch of data, automate a lot of the observability and performance monitoring, see if you can do some self-healing, self-learning, and then really automate the task that would be performed by the operator. So they outline all that and then get into really the HP Enterprise solution that they mention is, HPE Info Insight. And so, I didn't find, a whole lot new in what they, were really describing. I just think, putting IT on autopilot, it's kind of like self-driving cars. I think there are units of IT and certain components of IT that you can put on autopilot. And actually a lot of it is on autopilot now. But it's really is the entire kind of end-to-end IT and, everything that's happening. Is that really going to be on autopilot? I don't think so. But I do think there are significant parts of IT that are occurring in the cloud, or servers being stood up and stood down, and auto provisioning of storage and compute time, and software defined networks to bring up network on demand. A lot of that is on autopilot. It's just that the whole thing end to end isn't completely going to be on autopilot.
Yeah, I would agree with that, right? So I'll give them that piece, and you could go back in time, right, and go back to, the days of HP OpenView, right? Like, let's go back to the beginning of time, right, where dinosaurs roamed the earth, and
and HP monitored,
and HP OpenView was monitoring everything. It was just basically it was just generating alerts and sticking everything into an alert database and an alert window, and then a company like Micromuse comes along and says, hey, there's a lot of alerts in here, and there's ones that we don't want to see, and there's ones that we want to enrich and change and things like that. And we want to concatenate some of this stuff so that it makes it better, more readable and understandable to the operator instead of a bunch of numbers and letters. And, that's what they did, right? And they built it in that they put that portion of alert processing on autopilot, right? And then the users were able to then start looking at their event list, right? Well, then they had to. Then the operators had to then say, okay, I've got all these alerts. Are some of these related? Are some of these parent-child? So this is a parent alarm right here that's creating all these children alarms. And if I fix the parent, then all the children alarms go away. And it's a very manual intensive task to do that. So they come out with auto discovery, which leads to topology and root cause analysis, and they put that on autopilot. So there's this constant, iteration of going through this, and here we are, right? So root cause analysis. Now we're talking about using ML and AI for root cause analysis, like the 7 use cases we just talked about, and it's the same problem, just on, as you said before. I think you just brought up a really good point earlier. Same problem, different scale, right? Yeah. And it's kind of funny because I'm reading this article, and they actually do say, right, the system monitors performance. They can see anomalies. We have algorithms that run in the background. So all the telemetry data in one pane of glass. And I'm like, gosh, I think I was talking about single pane of glass in 2004, right? Mm-hmm. So we're kind of having the same conversation, but now it's with AI. And I guess my point of all this is that, putting out statements like, putting IT on autopilot or automating, automating things, organizations out of existence, and the reduction of, and there's I started an automation company in mid 2000s. And one of the things we heard all the time was, is this going to automate people out of a job? And the reality is it never really happens, right? Because as you're automating, the scale of the problem is getting bigger. So you're just trying to stay ahead of the wave, right? Mm-hmm. And you still need those people, and some of them will get retrained, and most of them will get retrained, and some of them will get better skills, and they'll move around. And but ultimately, we are still dealing with a lot of the same problems. And now we're just looking at AI and ML, which I have said this many times before. I believe is a huge shift for AI operations, right? I mean, for IT operations teams, a huge shift, and this is a big deal. And it's probably one of the 3 or 4 big deals that I've seen in my career. But I also want to make sure that we don't oversell it, right? And we don't over promise like we have in the past, and vendors have in the past of, hey, this is going to change everything. Where I think what it's going to do is it's going to make everything easier, but you got to stay on top of it, because as you're deploying these algorithms, the wave is getting bigger still, right? Mm-hmm. And you're always going to be in front of it, and you always got to be using new technologies to solve essentially the same problems that we've always been trying to solve.
Yeah. To me, I think the big dilemma that was the same dilemma in the 90s and 2000s as it is today is there's data and there's context. And data is just events that come in that just have a bunch of information, or logs that come in that have a bunch of information, or performance metrics that come in with a bunch of information. There's AI and ML approaches that says just look at the data, and do you see trends? Do you see things that you can tie together? But really, you're so limited until you bring context to it, which is, do you have a full grasp and data model that represents what the sort of static and interactive nature of your IT, the topology, or all of your systems and how they're interrelated together, and what's in the CMDB is one way to tackle that. And I think that's really where more advanced machine learning is just looking at data trends, but also putting it in the context and starting to identify, well, where in that context, where in your topology, where in your environment is there the issue, and how things relate to each other. And I think HP, CA, some of the big ones always took that approach, and other products said, no, we're just going to collect the data and apply machine learning algorithms. And I think it's the same problem today, that it's getting a full picture of your environment that's rapidly changing, and the data that you're pulling in, and how do they connect together. And I think there are some tools out there that are trying to do one or the other, but it's those companies that are really trying to do it all together in an integrated way, like HP is doing, and like ServiceNow is doing, and like Dynatrace is doing, and a bunch of other bigger companies. That's really where the win is, but it's extremely complex.
Yeah, I agree, and I agree with your. There's data and then there's context, right? And if you go back in time and you look at, go look at ITIL, right? I mean, ITIL V3, ITIL V4 talked about event management, incident management, problem management, and event management is really all about that data, right? You're just collecting data, and how do you handle all that data? Incident management is providing context to it, so you can actually then work an incident. So you may have tremendous amounts of data that only generate one incident, right? Mm-hmm. And you're using that data, and you're using systems like root cause analysis, stuff like that, to provide all that context. And then you may be pulling information in from your service desk to understand who's the customer, what the priority of this is. So you bring all that context, you create an incident. And then problem management is really looking at trending analysis and trying to figure out, okay, why are we getting so many incidents? So we may have to look at the incidents. We may have to go back and look at the event data to understand, okay, what is the overall problem we have? Because we're getting a lot of incidents, and it may be just a single problem, like a configuration file that's been pushed out to 1,000 servers that are creating these little incremental problems. And there's a larger issue at hand here. So, and those are all the same things we do today. Right. And exactly. Now we're just trying to use AI and ML to enhance that context, and to, enhance the trending and pattern matching, and figure out what's really going on. So good. All right. Any other comments?
No, that's it. I think we made a bunch of comments today.
We did make a.
We didn't try to solve the world's biggest problems either. So
no, I can tell you right now, we cannot solve the world's biggest problems. So I'll focus on what I can change. So one thing I wanted to announce is that starting next week, actually, you and I are going to take a little bit of a break, because we are launching about a month, 2.5 months worth of interviews with the leading AIOps platform vendors out there. So tune in over the next month and a half, probably through about mid-May, where we will be every week we'll be interviewing executives from these platforms and these companies to understand what the AIOps platforms are. You're going to learn a ton about what these platforms can do. Focus in on 3 or 4 core differentiators that each one of them has. It was a lot of fun recording these with these executives, and we'll be doing it every year, I think, going forward. But so tune in for that, and with that, I think we'll sign off for the day.
Yeah, and I'll see you around and on here in May.
I'll see you in the summer. How's that?
Yeah, that's right.